Hi everybody, welcome back to CLCV 231. This is the fourth lecture of the semester, um, and this is where we first start talking about cities themselves. Over the last couple of lectures, I've talked about the early history of humanity and some of the preconditions for the development of cities, things like agriculture, the so-called Neolithic Revolution, and the ways that these things intersect with how people have physically lived their lives and the settings in which they have lived. Today, um, if last time we looked at those things in the context of the Levant and southern Anatolia, what is today the territory of Turkey for the most part. Today we are going to move further to the east and further to the south, and look at the end of the Neolithic in Mesopotamia, the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in what are, approximately today Syria, Iraq, bits of Kuwait, and southern Iran. So, kind of overarching this lecture and the next several lectures are going to be some bigger questions. How do we define a city? What is a city versus a village? We looked at village societies last time. And today we're kind of on the line between villages and cities themselves. Once we get to cities, that also kind of begs the question of what is a state and how do states form? What are the relationships between the city as a concept and the state, again, as a concept? And how do they interrelate? Do cities require states? Do states require cities? So, in practical terms, we're going to look at the late Neolithic precursors of cities in Mesopotamia. And I've got some names up on the slide for you. Then we're going to move to the very earliest of what are, canonically considered to be the first cities of Mesopotamia, places called Eridu, Ur, and Uruk. And then the spread of those cities back into northern Mesopotamia. And we'll look specifically at the site of Kirsu. And then we're going to spend a little time kind of theorizing the state, because states are going to be increasingly important over the course of the semester. And so it's worth spending some time thinking about what this big idea is. I want to look at a couple of definitions of a city. How scholars define cities has, like so many other pieces of scholarship, changed widely over the course of the last 150 years. In the 19th century, some definitions of cities were almost ludicrously specific, with some scholars attempting to set out like very precise definitions by population density. Let's say, just for instance, 350 people living per, 100 meters square, as the definition of a city. Over the course of the 20th century, there have been, several different attempts to define cities in different ways. Now, this is especially important and interesting for us, not just in terms of you guys understanding like the history of the city as an idea and how it's been studied, but also because several of the archaeological sites that we either have looked at in the last couple of lectures, like Jericho and Çatalhöyük, or others that we'll look at a little more thoroughly today and in possibly also in lecture 5, this site of Maidanetska in the modern state of Ukraine really kind of trouble these definitions of what is a city. So, some definitions of a city. In 1938, American sociologist Lewis Wirth put forth a relatively simple definition of a city in contrast to some of these almost ludicrously specific 19th century, almost mathematical definitions. So for Wirth, he says, for sociological purposes, a city may be defined as a relatively large, dense, and permanent settlement of socially heterogeneous individuals. So it needs to be relatively large in comparison to sites around it, relatively dense, permanent, and have a wide variety of people. Now this seems pretty sensible. So Vere Gordon Childe in 1950, Childe who we have, heard from many times over the last couple of weeks, tried to set out a much more specific list. This here is a paraphrase. He published this in a long article in actually in an urban design journal in 1950. Rather than a journal on anthropology or archaeology, which is a really interesting choice. These criteria that he lays out are all things that he had developed in the course of his work, especially since the 1930s. And this may seem, again, quite specific. So somewhat like Wirth, population density and the size of a city are important to Childe's list of criteria. In composition and function, the urban population differs from that of a village. So Childe is starting to think about specialization of crafts and specialization of occupations. His third criteria involves taxes of one sort or another. Most of what Childe studied and what we're going to look at for the next, for most of this class are actually cities that existed before money, before the institution of coinage or money. This is all in a barter economy. However, taxes, alas, are older than money by quite a bit. And so the existence of some sort of tithe or tax is Childe's third requirement for a city. Monumental architecture is number 4. A ruling class, so not just specialization of crafts and occupations, but also priests, civil and military leaders, bureaucrats who absorb the major share of those tithes and taxes are his 5th criteria. Writing is number 6. Other sorts of intellectual activity, especially science, what we would call the sciences, although in the ancient world, this division between science and humanities, it was not a thing yet. However, he also, Childe's list also includes recognizable artistic styles, regular trade over long distances, especially with other political and cultural entities, and a thing that he calls the state, and that is based on residence of location, rather than kinship, rather than family structures. And this is kind of a tall order to have all of these at once in the ancient world, We're going to, this is a fully blown, almost modern state. Um, so Child's List might also be a little too specific, just a little too small of a needle to thread in some of these cases. Looking a bit more recently, Bruce Trigger, who is a Canadian archaeologist and anthropologist, actually changes the focus quite a bit from these set of sort of physical criteria, size, density, are there taxes, are there specialized occupations, to something else completely. So in his view, it is generally agreed that whatever else a city might be, it is a unit of settlement which performs specialized functions in relationship to a broad hinterland. And this is really interesting because what Trigger's doing here is shifting the focus from what a city is to what a city does in relationship to the rest of the area that it affects. Specialized functions, these can be all sorts of things. This could be religious, this could be ceremonial, this could be governmental. So Trigger's definition was really a shift in thinking about cities from a physical definition of a city to sort of a functional functional definition of a city. We're going to, incorporate pieces of many of these over the rest of the semester, and think about not just what, cities are and what physically makes a city, and what, like ideologically makes a city and what governmentally makes a city, but also what cities do. And this brings us back to these sites that we have looked at or will look at momentarily, and thinking about, how do these sites really, fit or not fit these various definitions of a city. Jericho was much larger, much denser than many of the places around it. It had, monumental architecture. This, you guys remember the tower and the city wall. Eventually the ditch built around it that actually dug through bedrock in places. And, these were pretty massive public works, pretty significant investments of labor and resources in terms of people and the resources to feed them and power that work in building this massive tower and wall and keeping it up. It's also an investment, a symbol of investment in symbols, investment in an image. So there. However, Jericho didn't show a lot in the way of things like recognizable government or it predates writing by thousands of years. There isn't a lot of craft specialization visible in Jericho. Similarly, Çatalhöyük was very densely populated and relatively large, but was, there was no, as far as we can tell, monumental public architecture, no craft specialization, some trade with a wider area, similarly with Jericho, but also. So in the case of Çatalhöyük especially, some scholars will call it an early city, some will call it a proto-city, some will call it a very large village, and there is no general consensus. So the site that I'm sure you are not yet familiar with, Magnetska, is a site outside of the Mediterranean world, but one, since we're talking about the development of cities, that deserves a little bit of attention. So, how do we define cities? On the left in this slide are plans of three of the canonical first cities of southern Mesopotamia. The site of Eridu, which is the one that the ancient Mesopotamians themselves identified as the first city. Eridu is a collection of small hills, those tell sites, around a very early series of temples. We'll look a lot more at Eridu in this lecture. The other two, this Uruk, also known as Warka, and Ur, all three of these are in southern Iraq. So, Mydnetska is perhaps, superficially similar. It's also roughly oval. But in terms of the way, and roughly oval, and it has walls. However, there are some major differences between this site in the central Ukraine and these cities in southern Mesopotamia. First of which, it is earlier. And I'll talk a bit more about the culture in general, but Mydnetska as an archaeological site is, in fact, at least 500 years earlier than the first things that we can call urbanism at Eridu, and definitely earlier than what we can call urbanism at either Ur or Uruk. Rather than being centered on a massive architectural complex, like all three of these cities, which are roughly centered around the massive temple platforms called ziggurats with their temples on top of them, palaces, especially here at Ur, massive religious complexes here in the center. Instead, at Mydnetska, we have an empty space. In the middle of this walled, and this is a wall, that line there that I'm tracing, walled village compound, or walled compound, but it's, this is a huge space. I'll talk more about exactly how big this site and its the similar sites throughout Eastern Europe are in a second. So Mydnetska is one example of the dozens, if not hundreds, of what are called megasites, or sometimes proto-cities, of the Cucuteni Trypillia culture. Cucuteni Trypillia culture, which we find remains throughout roughly this part of Eastern Europe. Ukraine, Moldova, Romania, all just west of the Black Sea, but not quite on the Black Sea coast. These people in the late Neolithic period had striking and sophisticated pottery. They have culture of figurines, female figurines, which we think had something to do with their religious culture. We have some of the earliest uses of wheels, although they're all on toys, which is really interesting. But this wheeled bull figurine is the earliest known example of an object on wheels. The people of the Cucuteni Trypillia culture seem to have lived in moderate to large family groups, in large timber and wattle and daub houses that would have contained roughly 5 to 10, between 5 and 15 people each. These had storage space on the lower level, and then living space up above, centered around a large clay hearth set into one side of the structure itself, and a large, what seems to be large open porch in the front. So this is a reconstruction of one of the houses with a raised platform from the megasite at Maidanetska. Maidanetska itself is the largest of these megasites. It lasted for about 300 years, between roughly 3,900 and 3,600 BC. Throughout this culture, in the 500 years or so preceding the boom of these dozens of megasites, we see the proto-Cucuteni Tripilia people living in small scattered villages. And then, starting around 4100 BC, we start to see these new sites that are extremely large, and they are most of them laid out very similar to this, concentric rings of houses, and each of these little squares, each of these little rectangles is a house. Concentric rings of houses, walls, the purple squares and the blue squares on this diagram, and so now you can get a better idea of how large this is. If the houses are this tiny, to get it all into one piece of paper, that gives you a much better sense of how large these sites are. There seems to be neighborhood organization here. You can see kind of how these are, there's kind of a pie shape. You can see like there's a space here, there's a space here, and then there seems also to be some sort of neighborhood meeting house. Some archaeologists who don't want to interpret ahead of their data just call them exceptional buildings. These exceptional buildings seem to be arranged roughly, one per neighborhood, one per group of, 50 to 100 houses. These are interesting because it implies, along with the lack of what could be called monumental architecture at these sites, other than a few larger exceptional buildings, it becomes, it begs the question of how sites this large were governed. And before I get into that, let's give you guys a better idea of how large these are. Maidanetska is the largest, but it is not, far and away bigger than other megasites of this culture. At its height, around 3,700 BC, the settlement encompassed about 250 hectares. That's 620 acres, or about a kilometer and a half, just under a mile from one long end of the site to the other by 1.1 kilometers, or 0.68 of a mile wide. That's big. That's really big, especially for the ancient world. Most sites that we're going to talk about in Mesopotamia are much smaller than this, at least for several thousand years. In terms of population, So much of this site has been explored by non-invasive means, ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, those sorts of methods of investigation. But there have been excavations at Mydnetska, and they are ongoing. At least they were ongoing up until 2022. So, at the moment, scholars have identified somewhere between 2,300 and 3,000 houses in existence at the same time around 3,700 BC. The most conservative estimates of the population run around 12,000 people living in Mydnetska, around 3,700. With a likely average around 29,000 and kind of an outside possibility, the high estimate of around 46,000 people. That's not too much smaller than the population of Urbana itself when, in the summer when the university is not in session. Just to give you guys a better idea, the current undergraduate population of the University of Illinois is somewhere around 65,000 people. So this is, what, 2/3, give or take, of the undergraduate population of Urbana, Urbana-Champaign, living in, one very large community. Compare it with estimates of the population of various early Mesopotamian cities, around 3,700 BC is about as early as we can make good estimates of the population of these early Mesopotamian cities. Eridu is, in fact, the only one in 3,700 BC that we can make any kind of estimate at, and the best guess is somewhere in the neighborhood of 6,000 to 10,000 people at Eridu, which the people of Mesopotamia, traditionally considered to be the first city. And then around 3,500 BC, again, a rough guess of about 10,000 people in Eridu, about 10,000 people in Larak, and about 14,000 in Uruk. So still barely breaking this conservative estimate for the population of Mydnetska. So why are we not thinking about Mydnetska as the first city? Why have these sites in Eastern Europe not overtaken Mesopotamia as the foundation of urbanism in Europe and the Middle East? This is for a couple of reasons. First of all, these sites in Central and Eastern Europe are only just being excavated and discovered. There has been, serious, if uneven in quality, scholarly interest in the first cities of the ancient Near East since before the 19th century. Many of the sites that we will talk about over the course of this semester are sites that have significance in Christianity and Judaism and Islam, and many of which are mentioned in the Hebrew scriptures, including Ur, Uruk, etc., etc. There is no written evidence related to these sites in Eastern Europe. Furthermore, we have textual evidence of the ancient times from Mesopotamian cities. They wrote on clay tablets in cuneiform, a kind of writing that was used for multiple languages in the ancient Near East, and from which we have tens of thousands of documents, many of which actually at this point have never been translated. There is, no Um, there is no comparable sources for Maidanetska. Everything we have is purely archaeological. Um, these sites in Eastern Europe were only just seriously investigated in the 1960s. So there are, whereas Mesopotamia, they started to be seriously investigated in the early 19th century. Again, this is, a huge gap of time in terms of um, scientific progress. Finally, um, in spite of their really impressive size, we don't, or at least so far, scholars have not identified a lot of craft specialization or other things that those definitions of cities that we looked at a couple of slides ago, especially V. Gordon Child's list, were based on. Now, this does become kind of a circular argument because V. Gordon Child in particular based his list on these early cities of Mesopotamia, which does, if these are the cities the definition is made from, then once you get outside of the early cities of Mesopotamia, you're going to have a much harder time identifying things that are early cities. And this actually is a problem in some of the other very well-known cultures of the ancient Mediterranean, like ancient Egypt. I'll talk about ancient Egypt probably in the next lecture, at least briefly. But basing the definition of cities on Mesopotamia, for many scholars, leads to to Egyptologists in some ways having a harder time identifying comparable cities in Egypt. So these, the jury is still out on whether we can call these Cucuteni Tripilia megasites like Maidanetska early cities. Are they proto-cities? Are they just absolutely gigantic villages? And we will come back to this, problem a couple of times. So here's the thing. Cities are not just buildings. They're not just about population. And if they were, we'd be calling Maidanetska the first city pretty quickly. Something happens when people crowd together in cities. This is a thing that has been noticed by, scholars, by philosophers, by the many people who have since the the fourth millennium BC moved to cities. One of the like, I don't know, most descriptive quotes, most descriptive statements about this is by a scholar named Fernand Braudel, from his 1981 book, The Structures of Everyday Life, where he describes urban environments this way. Towns are like electric transformers. They increase tension, they accelerate the rhythm of exchange, and constantly recharge human life. So this is in many ways a functional definition of a city, if perhaps a little more poetic than Bruce Trigger's. And I think it's, worth pointing out also that, urbanism, the whole phenomenon of cities in general, is a topic across multiple disciplines: sociology, anthropology, urban studies, architecture, design, as well as archaeology. And we all have things to tell each other. And looking, cross-culturally, cross-disciplinarily, I think it's worth keeping a relatively loose definition of cities, especially because scholars of ancient urbanism around the world today are kind of coming around to the idea that cities in the ancient world were not just one thing. They had different physical forms. They had different social and organizational purposes, and many had different trajectories. For example, those mega sites like Maidanetska really only lasted as a phenomenon for about 300 years. And after this intense period of massive sites in that region of Eastern Europe, just like before the megasite phenomenon, archaeologists saw people living in small, relatively egalitarian, seemingly collectively governed villages. There is this 300-year experiment in massive agglomerated sites. But then these sites seem to fall apart. And instead of continuing for thousands of years, as many of the sites in the Mediterranean that we will look at, and especially here in Mesopotamia today, people dispersed in the Cucuteni Tripilia culture and went back to low density, scattered, small to medium sized egalitarian villages. And we're not entirely sure why. There are scholars who have theories that had to do with rising social inequality, but that is just one theory among many. So, I would say that, to come back to these definitions, I think that, beyond, trying to figure out what a city is and what a city does, one of those things that a city does, no matter what form it takes, is that, cities really amplify the social, economic, and creative outcomes of human interaction, both positive and negative. Um, Crowding people together, putting people in contact with each other in this intense, almost involuntary way, leads to both incredible, incredible works of art, incredible works of culture, incredible um, positive effects, but also incredible negative effects. And we can see those negative effects in almost any major city we go to. Social inequality, problems of government, trash, litter. Um, all of these things are amplified in cities. And once again, these are things that multiple scholars have studied and done important work thinking about, and these effects have many names: agglomeration effects, energized crowding, an idea of urban spaces, what other scholars call a social reactor. Um, and this is very much at the core of what we're going to be looking at for the rest of the semester, is like this intensifying effect of cities. So this is just another really good um, encapsulation of these effects that cities have um, on people in general. And I'll leave you to read this on your own. So let's leave aside that very abstract thinking about, what is a city, and definitions of those sorts of concepts,